So I've entitled my reflection for today, Reflections on Rome. And I have to say that this sabbatical so far has been a tremendous blessing. Just tremendous on many, many fronts. And so every day over there I praise God for this extraordinary opportunity that He has granted to me. I feel, I have to admit, a bit unworthy of such a grace because I know that so few other people in this world get the privilege that I have to be away for 3 months and to pray so much and to pray in Rome and to write a book. I am also humbled by the number of people who have helped make this possible. Those who are doing all the work that I'm supposed to be doing back here, and those who have financially supported this adventure, those supporting with prayers. I have to admit, I'm also surprised at how hard people are working to actually not bother me while I'm over there and let me be. And I am particularly surprised at my brothers and youth apostles and my sisters who are leaving me be to have it truly be a sabbatical. I returned to Rome on Sunday for the last month of this sabbatical, so it's a quick turnaround this week. So I want to share with you some of my reflections. And as I was sitting and praying and reflecting upon what I want to share, there were 3 things that came to my mind. The first, the most important of which, is that I think that the first major reality that is at the forefront of my mind while I'm in Rome, honestly, is the gift of the saints. The gift of the saints. And so each of our 3 patron saints and youth apostles spent time in Rome. And so that has just been absolutely fantastic. So St. Francis of Assisi went to Rome. I mean, Assisi's not that far away, but he did everything by foot. But he went to Rome several times in order to meet with the Pope, to talk with the Pope about his community, and to get approval for the rule, the first major rule that he wrote for the Franciscans. And his time there was significant, and it had a big impact upon the church. I mean, Francis was a man so in love with God and so completely given over to a simple gospel way of life that he deeply impacted everybody that he ran into, and including the Pope, 2 popes in particular, and the Cardinals over there. And so St. Francis is one of the patron saints of Italy, and so he's everywhere. I don't think there's a church that doesn't have at least an image or a statue of St. Francis. He's everywhere. St. Ignatius of Loyola spent the last years of his life in Rome, directing his community from Rome, because in the end he determined that was what he needed to do. And there are 2 major churches dedicated to St. Ignatius in Rome. One is the Gesù, which is kind of the mother church for the Jesuits in Rome, and he's buried in that particular church. And so to pray there before his tomb is just enormously powerful and a real blessing. Now, I'm discovering all kinds of things while I'm over there, and so one of the things that I discovered is, some of you may have read this a little bit already, but across from his tomb in the Church of the Gesù is the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament. Every one of these major basilicas has one particular chapel where the Blessed Sacrament is there all the time for people to come and pray before. And it's dedicated to the Sacred Heart, so that was another reason for celebrating the votive Mass for the Sacred Heart today. But in that chapel, there are 7 pictures of St. Francis in the church dedicated to the Jesuits and to St. Ignatius of Loyola. And so for a youth apostle, that's a beautiful coming together of these 2 saints. And part of the beauty is that St. Ignatius of Loyola, when he was going through his conversion, read a book on the lives of the saints, and part of what inspired him was that he wanted to become a soldier for Christ and give himself radically to God in the same way that St. Dominic and St. Francis did. And so it makes plenty of sense. St. John Bosco, our third patron saint, was asked by the Pope to build the Church of the Sacred Heart in Rome. He was actually struggling with putting the funds together, if you can fathom this. The Pope was in the late 1800s. And he asked St. John Bosco to build a church in Rome from Turin. I mean, he was living in Turin, which is not that close to Rome. And so St. John Bosco had that church built, and it's beautiful. And he's very present in it, some images of him. And right next door is an oratory that the Salesians run. And so when you go into that church, you hear children yelling and screaming, which is just fantastic. And there's also a museum. In his last days, the Pope insisted that he come to Rome to be present for the dedication of the church, of the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. And it was he was old at that point. He was dying, and he was not healthy enough really to go. But the Pope was pretty insistent, and so St. John Bosco went. And he stayed in a room right next to the Basilica, and they actually built an altar in there for him so he could celebrate Mass towards the last days of his life. And so there's a museum there that's set up exactly the way it was when St. John Bosco was there. So those are just our three patron saints in some of what I'm experiencing while I'm over there. Another element to the saints are the early martyrs, and that's just an enormously powerful and very, very kind of ever-present element of being in Rome is the early martyrs. So the church was illegal for the first 300 years, and some of the great persecutions of the early days of the church were just completely focused on the Christians. They were blamed for everything. They were blamed for the great fire in Rome that pretty much destroyed Rome around 70. And they just got blamed all the time. And since, you know, the emperors were gods and so forth, and you had to worship the gods, the Christians were just very heavily persecuted. And so the apostles themselves, Peter and Paul and Andrew, are just three of them. And so Peter and Paul are everywhere in Rome. Every church has an image of both Peter and Paul. And at the Church of St. Peter, the Basilica of St. Peter, you got the two big statues of Peter and Paul. And at the Church of St. Paul, you've got the two images of Peter and Paul. Everywhere you go, Peter and Paul are together, because they were the pillars of the church, the two great apostles. And it's neat how they're almost always together. And the way in which God used two very different men with very different gifts and talents to be so critical to the beginnings of Christianity is just fantastic. St. Andrew, I have a little place in my heart for St. Andrew because he's St. Peter's brother, and he actually was the first one who got to know Jesus. So he was a disciple of St. John, and at one point he was with St. John, and St. John saw Jesus along the Sea of Galilee, and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And Andrew left John and went to go follow Jesus. And Jesus turned around and said, "What are you looking for?" And and he said, it was just a great encounter with Jesus, and he says, "Come and see." And so after that, Andrew goes to get Peter and says, "We found the Messiah. You got to come meet this guy." So Andrew introduced Peter to Jesus. And then Peter, became Pope. But there's a beautiful church dedicated to St. Andrew. I have pictures that I'll show you towards the end. I was going to do them one at a time, but I'm not very tech savvy, and we weren't quite able to make that work this morning. Another element are the young saints. And so there are a ton of young saints in Rome, and as you can imagine, as a youth apostle, this is another inspiring element for me. So St. Agnes, and she was beheaded at around the age of 13 during the persecution of Diocletian around 304. And in one of the most famous squares or piazzas in Rome, Piazza Navona, which is actually a piazza where, they used to have the chariots and where they used to kill Christians. And so they're pretty sure that St. Agnes was killed in that spot, Piazza Navona. And there's a gorgeous church there dedicated to St. Agnes. And in that church you can find her skull and spend some time praying in front of the skull of St. Agnes from 304. And she's a little extra special because Mary Mount and many of you live in St. Agnes Parish. And so there's a little extra connection there. St. Cecilia, she died around 230. She refused to deny her faith as a young woman, bold and courageous and full of energy and life. And so she was murdered. And they have built a church right over what they believe was the home that she lived in, because they probably turned that into a home church, a house church, because again, until around 315 or so, Christianity was illegal. And so all of the celebrations of the Mass were in people's homes. The inside got a little bit modified to create a little bit of space and make it a holy place. They probably did that in her home for a while, and then they built it when Christianity was legalized. Then they built a church on top, and that church is a stone's throw away from where I have been living in Rome, Saint Cecilia. Saint Pancrazio, who's one that I have to admit I did not know anything about before I went over there, and he is just on the other side, and his story is a little bit interesting too. And Saint Pancrazio was his parents died at a young age, and so his parents sent him to their uncle, Diocletian, in Rome. And so he was living with his uncle Diocletian, and he converted. And of course, his uncle was not happy with this and said, you can't be worshiping this Jesus. You can't do that. As living in my house, you can't do that. He says, I'm sorry, I got to do it. And so his uncle, the emperor, had him beheaded. And then, of course, St. Aloysius Gonzaga. I know a number of you have gone to Gonzaga or sent sons to Gonzaga downtown. But he was a Jesuit who was in the seminary in Rome. And he was incredibly committed to penance, a powerful example. He had an innocence about him that was profound and beautiful. In fact, his spiritual director was St. Robert Bellarmine. And St. Robert Bellarmine said of Aloysius Gonzaga that I don't believe this young man has ever committed a mortal sin. And even though he was so innocent and so committed to chastity, he did great penance in order to stay and remain chaste. And was serving during one of the plagues and got sick and died at the age of 23, I'm pretty sure. And so he's buried in the church that's actually named after Ignatius, the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome, across from Robert Bellarmine. St. Robert Bellarmine, who's the chaplain at George, the chapel at George Mason is dedicated after. So, a third thing that I'll share, a fourth thing, I'm sorry, with regard to the saints that there was has been very moving to me, are the saints who helped to renew the city of Rome. Because, as you guys well know, the church is big, really big. And there's a lot going on, and sometimes when things are really big, they can lose some of their fervor. Sometimes people aren't doing what they should be doing, including popes down through the centuries. We know those stories. And I have been particularly inspired by those saints who came to Rome or lived in Rome and brought new life to the church by being holy and calling the church to holiness. And so St. Robert Bellarmine is one of them. A Jesuit, a cardinal, again buried in that church. St. Catherine of Siena wasn't really a saint of Rome, but she's everywhere in Rome. She was a third order Dominican. She was very bold and courageous. She was a mystic in prayer. And she helped encourage the Pope to go back from Avignon to Rome, where he should be. After a time of valid persecution, but after the persecution was over, it was time to go back to Rome. St. Philip Neri is called the Apostle of Rome. He founded the Congregation of the Oratorians. He was very human, very funny, very practical, great sense of humor, very available to the people. And he's buried in the Chiesa Nuova, which is right on one of the main drags there, and very inspiring. Then, of course, Pope John Paul the 23rd had a chance to celebrate Mass at his tomb a number of times. And it just another wonderful example of God doing great things in people's lives. So, according to the tradition that I have read, when they came time after the death of Pius XII, after the death of Pius XII, the cardinals came to Rome, and they according to some tradition, struggled a little bit with choosing a new pope. And so in the end, they chose somebody who was kind and gentle and a little bit older as a kind of interim pope. And little did they know that this gentle, beautiful, holy man was going to call Vatican II. And he was the one who called Vatican II, the largest, most ecumenical of all of the councils in the history of the Church. So, the saints. I'm going to say a thing about two more, and these are going to be more brief, and then we'll take a look at a few pictures. So, the second major reality that has really pierced my soul, as you can imagine, is the art in Rome. The art is truly extraordinary, all over the place, every church. You're walking down a street, there's something that hardly even looks like a church in the middle of a block. You go in there, and it's prettier than just about anything that we see here in the United States. And it's just a side church. And there are saints everywhere, even when you do that. So there's a tiny, as far as Rome goes, a tiny little church right in the town where I'm living. And I walk by this every day. And I walked in there just to see it. And over on the right-hand side are the remains of Cardinal von Twine, whose cause is up for canonization. He is now a servant of God, which is the first step on the process of becoming a saint. And his remains are right there in this chapel, just very close to where I live. And then on the other side, I was confused at the start. It looked like how they normally do tombs for the saints. Teresa of Avila, and I knew that there's no way that Teresa of Avila is in this tiny little church that's not named after her or anything like that. So I go over, and finally I found something that I read. Sure enough, her right foot is in there. And they have the whole thing set up like she's there. But I mean, got the right foot of Teresa of Avila right there. And that was just in this side church on the side. Interesting. The art in Rome, it's good for us to remember that most Christians were illiterate for most of Christianity. And so one of the best ways to teach was with images that people could see and remember, because they couldn't read the scriptures. And so, until the Gutenberg press, right, for the most part, it just was not easy for people. And so images can be very powerful. The art in Rome has a way of raising our minds, raising our eyes, raising our hearts, hopefully raising our lives to God. It's just, you just walk into a church and you go like this, and just all over. I think the art has a way of helping us focus on moments in time in the life of the church, moments in the scriptures, with a focus helps us pray. And I think that the art helps us celebrate our faith, and I think that Christian art helps us proclaim the marvels of God. They're used in churches for the celebration of our faith. The final thing that I want to share before we look at a few pictures is even with all of this, a theme that's very common in my life, as you will well know, is that there is a great need for prayer. Because I sit here and I go through the town. What I do most days is I write for probably 3 or 4 hours, 5 hours, and then in the afternoon I just go off for a long walk and I just go to all these different churches. I pray before the tombs of the saints. I soak in this art and I pray. And as I'm walking through the streets, there are so many Romans and people and just zooming through the city and never stopping to go into a church, never stopping to look at all of this incredible art, never stopping to go before the life of a saint and ponder how they lived their lives and ponder how that might help me live my life differently. And I think it's not only that, you've got gazillions of tourists, and they're going through, and they're going into the churches, and they're taking pictures, and they're experiencing the art, and they're experiencing some of these liturgies, and they're watching the Pope. But even the tourists, and even the pilgrims, do we take time to stop and really ponder the beauty and the truths of our faith? And so prayer is what helps us appreciate the saints and this art and allow it to be another channel, another avenue of God's efforts and desire to draw us close to Him and change our lives.